Hello everybody, welcome back to my second video on the hidden dimensions of fatedness in your birth chart. I hope you enjoyed the first one, and now I will be putting on an add-on specific investigation introduced by Vettius Valens with regards to the topic of eminence. So let's have a look. So the question is again, what renders a native eminent? This is part 2. It's all about Valens's method, and the third one will be about spear bearing, which is of course another very important factor having to do with eminence, but that is more considered with the topic of protection and support for the native, which is perhaps something different than eminence, but it sure is tied with it. But that's for next videos. Again, let's have a look at why this is so important. It is important because Valens said something about the difference between, let's say, charts of middling eminence or lower eminence or no eminence at all, and the person's in high eminence. And what needs to be done is that the images and the planets operate differently in eminent charts, and that means that eminence needs to be determined beforehand, because then it shows you as an astrologer which of the images and planets might have a different operation in the chart. And perhaps for very eminent people and people in high power, it is said that the malefics do not so much affect the native himself, but their action is more directed against people around him or her. I will try to investigate that as well, but in the last video I showed that, for instance, Albert Speer, who was a very prominent Nazi in Hitler's days in the war, was strongly protected by his eminence factors, simply based on the triplicity rulers, which I spoke of in the first video. And you could see that the malefics were perhaps less directed against him and sort of protected him as well. But that all had to do with eminence. So the reason why this is so important, it has to do with sort of this being established as sort of a hidden fate dimension in somebody's chart, simply because having eminence indicators in your chart, many of them which are perhaps stronger, then this changes the way your chart functions for you. So I would say that this is quite an important precondition for trying to delineate charts, but let's not get in over our heads in the sense that we do not alter it all too much, but we need to take it into account. So, okay, let's have a look at Valens's method of doing it in addition to the first one. So this is what Vettius Valens says in his book 2 of his anthology, chapter 23. Well, he first sort of talks about the two lights, of course, which are very important, having to do with eminence, because they are the shining lights, and they, whenever they are in a day or night chart, they are very important factors. So these need to be very good, and especially when there are in profitable places, which is all the places, the houses as we now call them, which is all of them except the 6th, the 8th and the 12th, and some say that the 3rd is also a less profitable place. So the second condition is, should they have oriental planets as their spear bearers? So this is for the next video, and none of the malefics opposing, and then they make the natives fortunate and estimable, commanding and kingly. Likewise also if the lords of these should happen to be upon pivot points. Please note the importance of the lords of in this case, the sect lights. These need to be strong and good, well placed, and then they certainly support the native in becoming eminent. So what is his other method? And this is how he introduces them, that method. he clearly says that it cannot be judged on its own. It needs to be judged in combination with the other eminence factors that I have already established in the previous video, especially having to do with the triplicity rulers, and in this case, of course, the sun and the moon are included also. As he says, it is not as refuting the former powers, but as further confirming them. So it's an add-on, but it's a very important one, as we will see in the examples that I will give. And what he does in this method, he introduces especially 3 lots, and the other 2 are also quite important, but they seem to be he first addresses, let me say it like that, he first addresses the first 3 lots that I mentioned here, a lot of fortune, a lot of spirit, and a lot of basis, and of the exaltation and the acquisition. The acquisitions we have already become familiar with, because that is the 11th place from fortune, having to do with financial gain, etc. And one of the eminence factors having to do with well, one of the factors having to do with eminence has to do with the amount of money a person has or establishes or gets when he or she is becoming eminent. So the acquisition is also an important factor. So let's have a look at what especially the lot of basis is and the lot of exaltation, because he will use that extensively, as we will see in the examples. So let's first have a look at the lot of exaltation. This is how Valens describes it concerning the exaltation of the sun and moon in relation to happiness, and happiness is often related to eminence in this case. So this is what he says: we have found a certain place to be mystical, and by experience we take by day from the sun at birth to Aries, which is the ram, which is the exaltation of the sun, and by night from the moon to Taurus, the bull, and equal amounts from the horoscopos, the ascendant. And wherever it should live off, consider this place and its ruler. Again, we have the emphasis on the lot itself and its ruler. These 2 are very important in this principle. Sorry. So this is how how Schmidt translated it and used it in his first translations of Vettius Valens. And what you can see is that he doesn't use the entire image of the bull and the ram in its entirety, but he uses the exaltation degree as given to us in the text from ancient astrology. So by day you take the ascendant plus the 19th degree, the 20th degree of Aries, minus the sun, and by night you take the ascendant plus the 4th degree of the bull minus the moon. So you put in a day chart, you put the sun on the ascendant, as I've explained in another video on the lots. You can find it on my channel, that video. So you put the sun on the ascendant, and where the 19th degree of Aries then ends, that's where you find the exaltation, and the same goes for the calculation of the lot of exaltation by night. So what further things does he say about this lots? Valens says, for which, if it should be found to be marking the hour or culminating, the hour is of course in the rising image and culminating in the 10th place, especially upon a pivot point of the lot, which is presumably the lot of fortune is meant, because we are certainly talking about fortune in this case, but it could also be the exaltation itself. This figure foretells one who is royal, with the remaining stars and sects showing the support of the nativity to be great. Again, you see here that he uses it in combination with the other considerations having to do with eminence. He further says, in another manner, when the nativity is of good reputation, and remember this refers to eminence of course, and the exaltation or the ruler is well situated, the offspring will be exalted. The offspring is the children of the said person, by command or by political or royal rulership, or by some other reputable trust. Okay. So yeah, that's what he says about the exaltation. So interesting. We're going to use this extensively in the examples that I'm going to present to you. And here we have a lot of bases. This is how you calculate it. Again, I refer to my videos on the hermetic lots. There's a series of that on that topic, the hermetic lots, on my YouTube channel. And I also said something about a lot of bases. I will not go further into it, but it's an important lot used in delineations having to do with the hermetic parts. And in this case, it also has something to do with eminence. So the importance is that a lot of bases always is placed under the horizon, so below the ascendant, descendant horizon. So that's important to take into account. So however you calculate it in the first calculation or the second one given here, it always needs to be under the horizon. So that is your check for having done the correct calculation. Okay, so let's have a look at some other stuff having to do with these principles. Now, in the first video on this topic, I introduced the example charts that Valens presented and printed in his anthology, described in his anthology, and I stripped these delineations from all the stuff that I'm going to talk about now, because that was a bit confusion, and I first wanted to introduce the triplicity ruler. So now I will be adding on the considerations given by Valens for this extra sort of delineation of support for eminence. So let's have a look. So here are the charts again that I used in the previous example, but now completed with the lots that Valens is using. You can see a lot of fortune, of spirit diamond, a lot of basis, and a lot of exaltation in blue in this chart. So let's have a look at what Valens says about it. And of course, he's always pretty curt, short, how do you say? Very short delineations, very short explanations for why this was the case in this chart. So he says this one will be fortunate, commanding, sovereign, one who possesses a royal fate and who is installed in great abundance. The abundance, of course, having to do with the acquisition, which is the 11th place here, the 11th from fortune, which is the 11th place in this chart as well, because fortune is in the first house, first place. 4, as he says, a lot of fortune and spirit and the basis ended up in the same zodiac, which is of course the balance, and Aphrodite, the lady of these 4, because Saturn is always also there, was culminating in Cancer. Culmination is a great, very important thing in this, in any chart, because the 10th place, of course, has to do with standing out in a crowd. And the Lord of the Trigon, which is a triplicity ruler number 1, which is in this case the Sun, as you can see, and the Lord of the Exaltation, which is Mercury. As you can see that the Exaltation is in the 9th place in the Twins, together with Aries, were found to occupy the Good Spirit, which is the 11th place, and in the Acquisition, which is the 11th from Fortune. Okay, so this is the basic delineation, but there is more, simply because we haven't yet dealt with how Valens uses this specific method in establishing eminence and trying to find if there is further support for eminence in a chart. So there's more. So let's have a look. So this is what he says about it. I'm surmising, I'm paraphrasing. Valens introduces Lotkin's considerations as follows. So in addition to the triplicity rulers of the sacklite and the sacklites themselves, he says find a lot of fortune and the condition of its domicile ruler, find a lot of basis and the condition of its domicile ruler, and find a lot of spirit and the condition of its domicile ruler. So, and then investigate whether or not these lots exchange places and or do their domicile rulers. So is the domicile ruler of the lot of spirit or the lot of basis in the 10th from fortune or conjunct fortune, etc., etc. So these are his considerations, and this is what he says about them. If then the rulers exchange places, for example, if the lord of the lot of fortune should be in the place of the basis, or rather the lord of the basis in the place of spirit, and lord of spirit in the place of fortune, etc., etc., such a one will be fortunate, royal, and notable. So we have some further considerations now based on the lot of spirit and the lot of daimon and the basis. And the interesting thing, of course, is theoretically everything with eminence has to do with the sun, right, and the moon being the sect-light. And of course, both and all three of these principles, the lot of fortune, the lot of daimon, and the lot of basis, are simply based on principles having to do with these two lights. A lot of spirit is, of course, the lot having to do with Helios, the sun, and a lot of fortune, of course, is the lot of Selene, Tyche. And the basis, as we have seen in a previous slide, is of course calculated by means of using these two lots and then finding the place where the basis is. So you can see a very strong fate concept having to do with these three principles. And we shall see in the lot of exaltation it's the same, because again these are based on the sun and the moon, right? He says, one example he gives of a delineation, and if the lord of basis should be set upon the spirit and the sun should be co-present with it, he will be fortunate, notable, and sovereign. Well, that's a pretty good example of how this functions, right? So you could say that the method that Valens introduces is actually sort of a further examination of things having to do with the sun and the moon, the principles, but now in the sense of introducing the lots, considering them, and of course the fortune 11th having to do with the acquisition is of course based on fortune itself. So actually what he does, and I've explained it in another video as well, he's going one step down. He's stepping down from the zodiacal principles by themselves in a natal chart, which is, in my view, the second level on the path downward, is the second level going down from principles to an actual birth chart. But now introducing these lots, he's going one step further down, because when in the lot realm we are actually in the world around us. Sort of. Please watch the videos on the lots again, where I explain this principle, this three-way manner of conceptualizing what happens when the principles of the planets land in a natal chart, and what happens when the natal chart is put in the world, as it were, and when you are born, you know, are of course located in a world around you, and there are also certain things working and happening, and these have to do with lots of considerations. So I think Valens is a very good example of a person who understood this and used it in his further examination of eminence. Okay, but this is not everything. He also introduces the lot of exaltation. So let's have a look at that. So the next step of this method that Valens introduces is looking at the lot of exaltation. So let's put it back in the chart again. And you have to go through the same examinations. And the interesting thing is that Kurt Manwaring has a very interesting software. It's called Delphic Oracle, and this he has a summation of the principles needed to investigate in this chart. So this is the way they are enumerated, and you can check them for whatever chart you have. So you need to check these things. Is the lot of fortune in the 10th from fortune? And I will address this for this chart, and you can see that yes, of course it is, because Venus, as was said, is culminating in the 10th place from the rising image, and also culminating in respect to Saturn, the lot of spirit, the lot of fortune, and the lot of basis, of course. So yes, there are three principles here strengthened or underlining the issue of eminence simply by having planets positioned in this place. So that's really great. So you can see here which one do not go, but it's not a principle of enumerating them and trying to say, well, when you have 5 of these things, then you will be very eminent, but things will probably be very fortunate for you. We can say that, of course. So please understand that this is not a matter of adding up and seeing who has more of these factors, although I think when you do add them up, there's a very possible indication that somebody will be eminent, but it does not mean the amount of eminence, I think, because as I've said before, or perhaps not said, but I will say it now, when a person is eminent does not necessarily mean that the person is well known or is a celebrity of sorts. No, that's not the case. It's somebody who has a very great impact on either his surroundings or society or the place where he lives. Might be a mayor of a town, for example, something like that. So that is a person who is eminent. So again, one of these factors could be enough together with the other ones, the promising primary eminence indicator, which are the sec-light, the trip rulers, and the spear bearers, to make somebody eminent. So please keep that in mind, but do not forget to check these factors because they can be of great importance. So here is the second example given by Vettius Valens. Again, we see the specific lots noted in the charts. So let's have a look at what he says about them. Of course, he says such a one will be commanding, sovereign, for the lords of the trigon were found to be upon pivot points and marking the hour. That's true because we have the sun in the ram, and you see that the sun and Zeus, Helios and Zeus are in the ascendant together with these excellent lot factors. So, and the lot of fortune and the spirit and the basis and the exaltation ended up in the same zodiac. So the location of these factors in the first place are the most important things to he takes into consideration here. But he goes on. Now Aries, the lord of these, is falling amiss because it's in the third place and is unwitnessed in this place. I addressed this further. I'm not quite sure what unwitnessed means, because normally it refers to configuration and aspects, and they are here certainly. So I'm not quite sure why he says that it's unwitnessed, unless he means that it's all about Mercury being in the 12th place, the domicile master of Aries, but I'm not quite sure. And Aries caused impediments and banishment and violent death, and the violent death has to do with being the lord of the conjunction, which is the prenatal syzygy, the conjunction of sun and moon, and Mars is the domicile master of these, of course. But what's also important is that Valens also uses the 8th place relative to fortune as a place of death, which is in this case the same one as the natal location of the 8th place in the zodiac of the Scorpion. So that might also be a factor. So let's have a look at his further investigation of this. And the lot indicators, none of them apply here, so they are not a contributing factor having to do with the eminence of this person. So in this example, the primary eminence indicators, the sec-light, the trip rulers, and the spear bearers, are enough to make him eminent. So no lot eminence indicators are needed apparently, so, and they are not there. So yet still this was a person of some eminence. What's also important is the role of the placement of the domicile master of all these factors in the ascendant, because what's important is that it didn't prevent eminence. That's a very important conclusion based on using the ruler especially, and not even by Mars being cadent. So that's something to take into account. Do not be misled by the idea that when the ruler itself is not well placed, is falling amiss, as it is in this case, it does not prevent eminence. But what it did do was spoiling everything later on. And that's an interesting observation, simply because the ruler of a specific image, of a zodiac, of a sign as it's now called, is often said to come into play later in life. So it sort of shifts from the place itself, in this case the ram with all these factors in it, and then slightly later on in life it shifts to the signification of Mars being in the third place. So that's interesting to take into account. But also you can see, of course, its domicile master is Mercury, Hermes, Mercury in the 12th place, which is in its depression as well. So that is a dire consideration. So yeah, this is a further examination of these factors having to do with this chart of somebody being quite eminent but ending up pretty bad later on. The third example that Valens gives is this one. He's very short about it. He doesn't explain anything. He just says, such a one will be commanding, a lord of life and death, for the stars are found to be properly situated. And the text in red is what I said in a previous video on this topic, as trying to explain the reasons why this is important in this chart. So the first lord of the trigon, the sun, is in the pivot of the ascendant. The Lord of Fortune falls amiss, yet its Lord Saturn is culminating, and whenever something is culminating, it might have an influence on somebody's eminence or status in the society. So this might be important. So, and the Lord Mars of the Exaltation, that we can find now in the 9th place in the Ram, is with the basis, as you can see in the 3rd place, where also we find, of course, Mars. And what's interesting is that Mars is diametrical to its own place of the exaltation, so that's an interesting factor, but we have no further information about this person, so we're not quite sure what it might indicate. And of course Mars, etc., is found to occupy the fortune 10th. So here are the fortune houses counted from the Lord of Fortune in the 6th place. And here you can see 3 eminence factors by means of lots as introduced by Valens. You can see that the Lord of the Exaltation, which is Mars, is in the 10th from Fortune. You can see that. You can also see that the Lord of Spirit is in its own domicile, Jupiter. You can see that as well. And the Lord of the Exaltation hands over to the basis, which you can see in the 3rd place. So yeah, this is an interesting example which introduces the factors having to do with the lot considerations as introduced by Valens for eminence, and you can see that they are quite strongly supportive of eminence in this chart. So yeah, that's an interesting example. It must be noted that in the previous examples, all eminence factors were under the disposition of just one planet. In this example, the additional eminence factors are scattered all over the chart. So this might suggest that each consideration is bringing up different kinds of issues having to do or having an impact on the eminence of this person. Unfortunately, we do not know anything more about this person, but it's again an interesting and compelling example of how to use these factors and how they can contribute to eminence. So let's now look at some modern charts using the same principles that Valens introduced for investigating eminence in charts, and I will be using the same ones as I did in my previous videos, simply to try to enhance whatever was seen in those charts. So let's have a look. So the first example that I used in the previous video was the chart of Lady Diana Spencer. I've shown her chart here again, but now with the extra lots that Valens introduced. And let's have a look at what this might indicate when we use his evaluation. So what you can see is, of course, the very important factor of Venus. Venus is in its own domicile in the bull, but it's in the 6th place, yet it is with the Lord of Spirit. So, and the other important factor is that, of course, the bull is the 10th place relative to fortune itself. So the location of Venus being the Lord of Spirit, being in the 10th place from fortune, is a very important factor in eminence of this person. And also you see the Lord of Spirit itself, which is Venus, Aphrodite, being in the bull itself is of course very important. So these are two contributing factors having to do with eminence in her life. The interesting thing is that, of course, she became well known in the second part of her life, even from a young age, because she married, I believe, the prince in 1980 when she was still very young. So it happened around, I believe, her 20th birthday or the 19th birthday. I'm not quite sure, but so that's interesting. So there are further considerations because I'm doing this as an add-on because I haven't shown this in the earlier slides, but there are also miscellaneous eminence indicators, and there are two of them when the ascendant lord is in the 10th place or the lord of the 10th place is in the ascendant. So please note that, but I believe in my example charts there is nobody who has such a configuration. So let's have a look at something else here, because take note of the further considerations that the exaltation itself, which is of course in the 10th place, is together with triplicity ruler number 2, which is Aries. And as I said, she became well known because of her marriage. And please take note also that Mercury rules her 7th place, which has to do with marriage. But according to ancient sources, the 10th place, of course, has a lot to do with your social standing. And marriage is a very important factor in that. And in this case, she married a prince. Please note that the ruler of the 10th place is with the sun, a person of royal, a royal person, royalty. That's an interesting one, and it was also a very difficult period for her, as can be seen by Mars being not of the sect in favor, and of course the ruler of the 10th and the 7th place, in the 8th place, under the beams of the sun, etc. So that pretty tough considerations here, but be that as it may, her exaltation really took place when she married the prince, and then this period started, and it's of course indicated by the ruler, the second triplicity ruler of the sect light, being the sun in the crab. So that's an interesting. This is something that Valens doesn't mention specifically, but it's these things that you need to take into account because they have to do with factors being in the chart themselves. So Mars being the second triplicity ruler has to do with natal considerations in the birth chart. And of course the lots that I'm introducing now and that Valens introduced have to do with stuff happening in the world around you, or because of certain things that you did or are or had, and the response, let's say, of the world around you to them. So this marriage exalted her, period, and her social status changed dramatically. And the fact that it's the ruler number 2, Mars, indicates this. It's the second period of her life. So interesting. Also note that the domicile master of the exaltation, which is Mercury, is with the sect light, which is the sun, of course, and it's in the 8th place. Interesting factor as well. And the sun being the domicile master of fortune. So again, you see here an interweaving of all sorts of considerations having to do with something that you would not note perhaps at first sight, at first glance, and now they are coming into perspective, I think. Also interesting, the MC of this chart is in the scales, Libra, this image, and Venus of course rules this image, and it's in Venus is in the place of the lot of spirit, so that's also an interesting one. And of course this is the most strong planet being in the fortune 10th, and interestingly enough she's also after she died tragically, Mars being in the 10th place perhaps. She was, of course, remembered as a very Venusian person, the Princess of Love, and I'm not sure what other names were given to her, but she was held in high regard by everybody, especially the people of the UK. So, okay, I think I've said all that I needed to say about this chart, so let's have a look at the next one. So here is the second example that I used in the previous video, and you perhaps remember that I somewhat struggled with trying to get to grips with the idea that there are a lot of eminence indicators in this chart that are really not that significant for somebody who is eminent. But of course Prince Andrew is eminent, but as compared to his brother Prince Charles, this person was also sort of in the background. I'm not from the UK, but here in the Netherlands, we hardly ever heard anything about him except for the interesting details having to do with his life, his marriage, etc. But we hardly ever heard anything about him, so he was sort of in the background of history, so to speak. This, of course, changed a few years ago, so I was struggling with this because when you look at the first two triplicity rulers being in a cadent place, that is not very supportive of being eminent. And the third triplicity ruler, the moon, being in aversion to both of them, the first and the second one, offers no help at all. So this was a bit of a conundrum. So what makes this person eminent? Because simply he was born into in royalty. So what's going on here? Perhaps the considerations of Valens can help us. So let's take note of some things that we can see here. We can see that the domicile master of fortune, which is Venus, because fortune is in the bull in the 10th place, not the MC but in the 10th image from the rising image in the place at the peak. This Venus is triplicity ruler number 1 as well, and she is with the second triplicity ruler Mars, Aries, who disposes of his diamond, which is in the Scorpion. So yeah, there we have a very interesting combination, which is a very powerful one, having to do with eminence. Would it not be for the fact that these two eminence indicators are cadent? They are in the 6th place, so they do not stand out as something that has to do, introduces a very strong eminence from birth, which is of course the case with this prince because he was born in royalty. So that's an interesting observation. And these two, Venus and Mars, are together with Saturn, Kronos, which is the ruler of the basis. As you can see, basis is in the sign of the Capricorn. So here we have a principle which puts them together, all three eminence factors having to do with the basis. And the basis, the interesting thing is that this basis can have the foundation of fortune, it is called. Yeah, and in a certain sense you can say that his eminence, albeit a bit in the background, is of course a very important basis in his life. So perhaps we can say that this is the factor that has to do with his personal life, simply because basis is a factor having to do with the fortune conditions, the things in the world, as it, so to speak. So here we have something interesting going on with this, these three factors being together in this chart, and thus having a very strong combination for eminence, yet in the background. So that's an interesting one. So let's have a look at something else that Valens perhaps introduces. And here you can see that there are actually quite a lot of eminence indicators activated in the sense that Valens uses them, because the Lord of Fortune, which is Venus, hands over to the basis. Yeah, that's right, because basis is in Capricorn. Again, the Lord of Spirit hands over to the basis as well, because the Lord of Spirit is in the Scorpion, and Mars is together with the Lord of the basis and basis itself. And then we see the Lord of the Exaltation. The Exaltation is in the balance, and Venus is of course its Lord, and that's also together with the Lord with the basis. And then the Lord of the basis itself, which is Kronos, Saturn, is in its own domicile, the Capricorn. So yeah, we have here 4 indications having to do with Valens's lot indicators, having to do with eminence, that are activated. So I think these are pretty interesting, perhaps solving the conundrum of why is this person's eminent, but also why is this person in the background. And some people would say, well, he has the sun in the as a ruler of his rising image, which is in the 8th place, and that's also an indication of someone being in the background. But I wouldn't say that this is true, because he was also often in the foreground, but not as prominent as his brother Prince Charles was. So that's an interesting observation, right? Now, of course, his life is in quite an upheaval, I think, because of this, the troubles that are now coming to face him. I will not do an extensive research on this, but simply point to some very interesting factors having to do with all this. So let's have a look at the 2001, the principle when this picture was taken with him, with Virginia Joffrey, who is now getting him in court to on trial of sexual abuse, because she was too young at that age to have sexual relations with anyone. So but the interesting thing is this: when we look at the perfection in this chart of Prince Andrew, we can see that in this period, in this year when this picture was taken, we're not quite sure about the dates, that was in the period of the Capricorn period, where we find the 2 rulers of the triplicity, and we also find the basis there with Saturn there. So that's interesting. So just to point that out. So these things are coming home to roost now, in a certain sense. I'm now looking at Zodiacal releasing from Spirit, because it has to do with something he did, it's actions he undertook. And when you look at the year of 2001, you can see that his major period was in this Capricorn period, and you also see Venus there. And one of the very interesting principles is that whenever a planet is in the image of the major zodiac releasing period, which is in this case Capricorn, and of course we find Venus there and Mars, so these 2 planets being in Capricorn are activated whenever their image is on level 2 activated in zodiacal releasing. And you can see that the period of 2001 is both under rule of the scales, ruled by Venus of course, and the Scorpion, ruled by Mars. So that's an interesting factor also, because well, it has to do with these principles, right? The sexual intercourse, and perhaps with somebody who was too young at that age. So, and when we look at the period in which he's in now, all the trouble started, of course, by several pictures being released, and you can say that when the major period changed to the image above the horizon, which is in this case the water pourer, then things came to the fore, became known to the general public. So you could say that his anonymity was, in this case of course, certainly compromised. So You can see here all the factors having to do with this quite difficult period. He was, of course, stripped of his rank as a soldier in several armies, services, etc., etc., and had to lay down several tasks having to do with him being a prince, being of royalty. So I will not go further into this, but please note that this is very interesting, and it all has to do with the Chronos-Saturnine principles. And of course, Saturn is now walking over his descendant, so by transit. So that's a very important period in his life at the moment. Okay, let's leave it at that, and perhaps I'll come back to this issue later in another video. But for now, this is enough. Please note the eminence factors being involved in all this. I will be quick about this one because the primary indicators of eminence in Spear's chart are quite obvious, especially the Venus conjunction with Jupiter in the 11th place. I've explained this in the previous video, so let's have a look at what's perhaps more notable, having to do with these extra lots that Valens introduces. The domicile master of the basis, which is the Sun, is with the zenith, the MC, in Pisces, so it's in the 10th place by portion, you could say. Also a fortune angle, because of course that's the 4th place counted from the lot of fortune in the Bowman. So that's an interesting one. And the domicile master of the exaltation, which is the moon in this case, is with the IC, so it's also pivotal, the fortune 10th. Also, so again, a very strong indicator for eminence. So yeah, we have the Lord of the Exaltation in the 10th from Fortune, and we have the Lord of Spirits in its own domicile. So again, some fortunate factors. What's interesting is that he was especially known as an architect at first, and that's an interesting one having to do with Saturn being the ruler of his lot of spirit, because a lot of spirit has a lot to do with what motivates a person to act and to go into some sort of business. It has not to do, Lord of Spirit does not indicate what kind of profession someone chooses, but it has a lot to do with what sparks action. So that's interesting that in his case it had to do with architecture, as was the case with Hitler, of course, who was also much fascinated with that activity. Valens says also, for if the exaltation should be found to be marking the hour or culminating, marking the hours in the ascendant, which is the case here, or culminating, which is the 10th place, of course, especially upon a pivot point of the lot, which is not the case here. This figure foretells one who is royal, with the remaining stars and sects showing the support of the nativity to be great. So this is an indication coming from a Valens specifically for the location of the exaltation, and this also goes for the chart of Spear. So okay, I have one other example which I'll first be doing anonymously, simply to whet your appetite, and let's have a look at how this functions in a chart. So indeed, let's do an anonymous chart. So this is a chart of an anonymous person, which I simply want to introduce to you simply by to illustrate again the idea of eminence and trying to find out whether or not this is a person of eminence. So let's first look at some chart factors. Now, when you look at these principles and these evaluations of the condition of the planets in this chart, it's all pretty bad, right? Because there is not one planet in its own places, its own image, and actually most of them, 5 of the 7 planets are in either detriment or in fall. So that's pretty bad. When you look at the rule of the first place being Mars in the Crab, which is the place where it's in fall, together with Saturn, the planet being also in the Crab, also in its anti-domicile. So yeah, that's not pretty good. The Sun, the sect ruler, the sect-light of this chart is in Libra. It's also in opposition with Aries, where it's exalted, so this Sun is also in its fall, as is Venus and Mars, of course. Venus being in the 11th place, and it's also in its fall, so that's all pretty bad, right? So this is not at first hand quite promising. Now let's have a look at the triplicity rulers. Wow. Of course, the Sun is the sect-light, so we need to evaluate the triplicity rulers of the scales, which is the first one is Saturn, the second one is Mercury, and the third one is Jupiter. And as you can see, these are all cadent, and again, Saturn is together with Mars, which is at first hand not quite elevating, not quite good for eminence. First of all, because they're all cadent. So Mercury is cadent in the 12th place, Jupiter is cadent in the 12th place. So that's pretty bad. Okay. So there they are, and again, not very well placed. So these are all pretty lousy. There's no support for eminence at all for this native, based on these principles alone. So this is not quite good. So the question then is, might Valens' method suggest otherwise? So let's introduce the lots. Then we find the location of them here, and let's try to see whether or not we can note something important. So the first triplicity ruler, Saturn, is also the domicile master of fortune, because we find fortune in Capricorn together with the moon, which is an important factor in the calculation of the lot of fortune. And it's together, the ruler is together with, is not together with, it's also the triplicity ruler of the first place. No, I'm sorry, I'm saying this wrong. It's the first triplicity ruler. That's it. And also note that the domicile master of the basis, which we find in Aries in the 6th place, is with the first triplicity ruler, Saturn. Interesting. So let's add the fortune houses. And here, of course, we see all the difference, because now we can see that the planets having to do with eminence, which is the triplicity rulers first and the sect-light, are all in fortune places. So you see Mars and Saturn being in the fortune 7th, and you see that Jupiter and Mercury and the Sun itself are in the fortune 10th. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. And you can also see that the Lord of Spirit being the Sun, of course, being Helios, is in the fortune 10th. So there's only one factor supporting this via the calculations of Valens. So yeah, so what do you think? Do you think this person is eminent? Well, let's have a look. Okay, now to use Valens's parlance, we can say the following thing, because I know who it is. He will be fortunate, commanding, sovereign, one who possesses a royal fate, and one who's installed himself in great abundance. I've not taken into account the fortune 11th place, which is of course the ascendant, having to do with acquisition. Okay, well, let's have a look at the person who it is. I will not reveal yet who it is, but we have established that a lot of these planets are in really dire straits because they are in very bad condition, and this showed in this person. He was a politician, indeed he was, who served as president of his country from 2010 to 2020, and he was elected as president by the people. And perhaps this is seen because of the lot of exaltation is in the 7th place, and the ruler thereof is Venus being in the 11th place, and the 11th place has a lot to do with support for somebody becoming eminent, or perhaps somebody striving to be president, etc. So you could say perhaps the people are signified by this lot of exaltation. They really exalted him in a certain sense. From 1980 to 87, he was the de facto leader after conducting a military coup. Hey, there we see something having to do with the first place. We see Mars being the ruler of the first place together with Saturn, Cronus, so there might be an indication that he did this, and that was bad enough in itself. But he was a controversial figure, therefore, because he was responsible for numerous human rights violations committed during his military rule in the 1980s, and most notable were the December murders in 1982, when he ordered the execution of 15 leading opposition figures. So, okay, interesting. He was prosecuted for these murders, and a trial was initiated, but the National Assembly extended amnesty to him in 2012. After the trial was forced to continue, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2019, of which he has yet to serve any part of that. In 1999, he was sentenced in absentia to 11 years imprisonment after being convicted of trafficking 474 kilograms of cocaine. And according to WikiLeaks cables released in 2011, he was active in the drug trade until 2006. And Europol issued a warrant for his arrest, so he cannot leave his country, because when he does, he will be arrested. His son, this doesn't end yet, his son was sentenced in 2005 to 8 years imprisonment for narcotics trafficking. Hey, there it is again, narcotics, weapons trafficking, and theft of luxury vehicles. He was released early for good behavior, because his dad was an important figure in this country. And he then was appointed to the government's counter-terrorism department, appointed him there a senior role, and he was sentenced later to a 16-year prison term in the USA after he was extradited. Okay, an interesting family, right? So you can see here that eminence is not necessarily a factor having to do with somebody being, let's say, a good person or an upright person. It simply makes a person eminent, and how this person treats his eminence is another matter, of course. In 2011, so when he was president, he granted a pardon to his foster son, who was convicted to 15 years imprisonment for the murder and robbery of a Chinese trader. And he was also convicted of throwing a hand grenade at the house of a Dutch ambassador there. The pardon was controversial, etc., etc. And he also hired convicts. His delegation that visited a South American summit had 2 members who had criminal drug records. So an interesting person, right? Perhaps you might have guessed who it was when it's Desi Bouterse. He was a Surinamese politician, and still at large in a sense. He's no longer the president, and he's out of office. And another interesting thing happened, that when the government took over after him, they had stolen sort of everything out of the official buildings. The computers were gone, etc., etc. So, yeah. So let this be a lesson that eminence has nothing to do with being upright or having sort of a moral compass. In this case, it wasn't the case. So, okay, that's this at first anonymous example. So this was the second video on the hidden principles of fatedness in your chart having to do with eminence. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time. And the next time, of course, will be about something I've struggled with for quite a while. Spear bearers. I did not have the juice to really research all the conditions having to do with spear bearing, but I will address it in the next video. So I hope you will be there then, and I hope to see you then, and I hope that you enjoyed this one. And let's have a look at some of my promotion for the other things that I do, and please visit my YouTube page, where you can find many more interesting videos on Hellenistic astrology. So thanks again, and see you next time.